Welcome, everybody. My name is Josh Gerstein. I'm a senior reporter with POLITICO, and we're here to talk a little bit about the journey within the Republican Party on the issue of immigration, where we stand in that metamorphosis at the moment, and where it might go from here, what the next chapters might be. I'll just briefly introduce people because there are detailed biographies in the handout, so I don't think we need to go into it at too much length. We're starting, just to make sure I get them in the right order, down the end with Alfonso Aguilar, who is president of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Principles and was an official working on citizenship issues and citizenship testing at DHS under President George W. Bush. Next to him, we have Tamar Jacoby, the president of ImmigrationWorks, which is a small business group that pushes for immigration reform and changes to immigration laws and policies. She's a longtime writer, journalist like myself, who's worked for Newsweek and the New York Times and spent quite a while at the Manhattan Institute in New York. Next to her, we have Daniel Garza, who is the executive director of the LIBRE Initiative. He's also a former White House official and Interior Department official under President George W. Bush. And then immediately to my right is Linda Chavez, who is president of the Becoming American Institute, a well-known syndicated columnist and a White House official in the Reagan White House. So we span a number of different Republican administrations here. I was thinking as we're getting ready for this panel about sort of the arc of the Republican Party and Republican White Houses on this issue, and it reminded me of, in a previous job, being at the White House on a Thursday morning in early September 2001 with President Bush and President Vicente Fox standing out on the south lawn of the White House, pretty ebullient, talking about the chances for immigration reform. And what I think, depending on what your viewpoint is, was either the high point or the low point, or certainly one of the key points in the evolution in the Republican story on immigration reform. And then lo and behold, that was a Thursday afternoon, and the next Tuesday morning, which was equally beautiful here in Washington, we had smoke coming up from the Pentagon and the attacks on the World Trade Center. And that was I think, in some respects, the end or a dramatic change to that chapter in the immigration reform discussion. But it's interesting because hopes were so high at that time, and then now we have this phase. I don't know if it's the valley of death phase or exactly what it is that people feel that they're going through with the Trump campaign on the immigration issue, at least people that have been pushing for some of the comprehensive bills over the last decade or 2 decades. So I thought we would start down the end with Alfonso, who has sort of I guess, fallen in and out of love with Donald Trump. Maybe that's too long, too
never in love.
It implies a greater degree of affection than maybe existed at any point. But you certainly have sort of a personal journey with his campaign, and I'm just curious if you tell us a little bit about what it was that you thought was doable with Trump and the Trump campaign on the immigration front, and I take it you no longer hold to that view, and what led you not to hold to that view anymore?
So basically the question is, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm not crazy. Look, I was, a year ago, one of the early voices within the Republican Party and the conservative movement, along with my good friend Dan Garza and others. Not many were actually criticizing Mr. Trump at the time. We're talking about July of last year, because they really thought he was not going to win the nomination. And I would get calls saying, "Why are you criticizing Trump? He's getting so much attention because of you. He's not going to be the nominee." Well, but I denounced him because of what he said about Mexican immigrants and his policy proposals on immigration. And then he won the primary. And as a conservative, to me, the alternative is truly unacceptable. I think Hillary's policies on the economy, on how to deal with the threat of terrorism, on issues that are important to me in terms of life, family, I think her policies will be disastrous. So what would somebody like me do? And I looked at Trump and said, well, let me see if we can somehow work with him to not only moderate his tone, but see if he can actually support a form of legalization. Now, I don't know what Donald Trump really thinks about immigration. I don't think he knows what he really thinks about immigration. But I do know that he was surrounded during the primary by a group of restrictionists, very close to Jeff Sessions, and I assume behind Jeff Sessions, people from Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA, and others. Stephen Miller, one of his senior advisors, spent many, many years with Senator Sessions. So clearly, I knew what he was trying to do during the primary, considering that there were 17 candidates, try to get that 30% of the Republican base that indeed opposes immigration reform from different reasons. There are many, indeed, perhaps not half of the bucket, that are racist, but there are many that are concerned, legitimately concerned about immigration, and he was getting their support. So once he won the primary, I thought that there was a chance of working with the campaign to get him to support, to embrace some sort of legalization. And so I swallowed hard and I said, okay, I'm going to support Mr. Trump and figure out if there's a way. I had noticed two things from the very beginning of his campaign. He had said that with deportation, that people would have to leave or there would be massive deportation, but the good people would come back and come back quickly. Well, to me, that sounded like touchback, something that was discussed in 2006, 2007. So I said, well, perhaps that's an opening to propose some sort of touchback, internal touchback. And as I started conversations with people in the campaign, they were actually surprisingly very open to the idea of dealing with the undocumented in a different way. And perhaps the idea of letting people within the country go to their embassy or consulate, register there, and then provide them a path to legal status short of citizenship. I have to say, by talking to several people within the campaign, senior advisors, they were receptive. There were people that were receptive. Now, Trump said many things during the primary, many offensive comments. His immigration policy in the website was clearly written by some of these restrictionist groups, but then he kept changing his mind. Remember with H-1As, in his policy statement, he went after Zuckerberg and saying that H-1A, it's an unfair program because these people are taking jobs away from Americans. Then in a debate in Miami, he said, I support H-1A. When he was reminded that he opposed it, he said, I just changed my mind. So, and just recently, last week, apparently he now supports some sort of DREAM Act for individuals who want to serve in the military. I don't know if he's aware of what he actually proposed in that forum. The same thing with H-1Bs, when he was confronted with the fact that he, in Florida, recruits, H-2Bs, non-agriculture guest workers. He defended the program, even though in that policy statement, the website, he opposed it. So hard to figure out. So I said, well, there's an opening there. I'm not saying that there's a real chance. It's a long shot, but let's at least try. And we tried, and I think there was an opportunity till days before the speech in Phoenix. I think it was a real chance. He started speaking about not deporting every single undocumented immigrant, only those with criminal records. He said he created the Hispanic Advisory Board. I was never a member of the Hispanic Advisory Board, just in case. I was offered a position, but because of previous commitments, I could not accept that position, but I kept in communication with the campaign. And it was clear in that meeting and in other meetings that he said that he wanted to deal with undocumented immigrants in a compassionate and humane way. In that meeting of the advisory board, he did ask participants what they thought about immigrants going to register at their consulate or embassy. So I'm assuming that they were considering the idea of internal touchback. And then he did a pretty high-profile town hall with Sean Hannity, where he basically said, I'm softening my position. I think at that time, restrictionists got really scared, and there was an intervention. And clearly, Mr. Sessions intervened, and that's how we ended up with the speech in Phoenix. And after that speech, there was any room for me to continue supporting Donald Trump, not only because of the policies, but even the vision that he outlined. Restrictionists made sure in that speech that their language was there, questioning even how positive immigration is. I mean, he talked about going back to historical levels of immigration before 1965, as if we have too much immigration. Immigrants are taking jobs away from Americans, so we have to, that's code language from nativist groups, from restrictionist groups who feel that our country's overpopulated and we have to, it's all about numbers. And that to me was very concerning. And obviously after that, I just said I cannot continue supporting him. And there were some people from the advisory board that felt the same way and resigned. And yet that became a big news story nationally. And that's where we stand. In terms of what Trump, if he were to become president, what his administration would be like on immigration, it's hard to say. We do know that he's going to have as advisors people who are restrictionists, who don't believe in immigration reform. But is he going to be loyal to that group? I have no idea. Obviously, there's a real chance that he would. So it's hard to say. But that is my journey with the Trump campaign. It was short-lived. But at the end, to me, I care deeply about the issue. And quoting Jacob Monti, a good friend of mine, an immigration lawyer from Texas who immediately resigned after the Phoenix speech, he said, in an interview to Univision, he said in Spanish, por una legalización me siento a negociar hasta con el diablo. He said, for immigration reform, I'm willing to sit down and negotiate even with the devil. And to me, that is a commitment that as conservatives we have. At the end, this is about building consensus between Republicans and Democrats to achieve immigration reform. We tried, it didn't happen, we move forward, we'll see what happens.
Thanks, Alfonso. Tamar, it seems like, as Alfonso was pointing out, this immigration issue is as much part of Trump's brand as anything, regardless of which policies are being advocated or what he says on one day in one interview or in one forum or when he's in Mexico or whatever. You've been looking at sort of what his supporters think on these issues. Is there some daylight there, and how can people respond to his brand specifically on immigration while disagreeing with him on the point-by-point policies that through people like Jeff Sessions and Steve Miller and others he's advocating?
Great. So thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you to MPI. I've not been on any kind of journey with Donald Trump, and so I am going to pivot and talk about the rest of the party, including his supporters. And it is always smarter to be cynical in Washington. We heard a lot of really dire scenarios on the first panel this morning, and I'm certainly not here to say it's going to be easy or we're going to be able to get this done next year for sure. There's certainly many more ways it can go wrong, and probably one narrow path that could take us to a good answer. But I do want to raise some questions, particularly about Trump supporters and about other Republicans on the Hill. So, if you were a Martian and you just dropped down to the U.S. and you watched the headlines, I think you would think, that Trump has kind of, we're watching a historic wave of xenophobia, I think is what you would think if you were Martian and you just dropped down. That Trump has found something beneath the surface that we didn't know was there, or that's much bigger and more powerful than any of us thought. This underground reservoir of hate and fear and bigotry. But I actually think we need to question that. I think that is a misleading sense of things. And I noticed it first during the 10 days of the softening. And, let's not make too much of the softening. I don't think Trump knows what he thinks, and I don't think he believes anything, and I think he'll say anything. So Trump's journey is not what's important to me. But I was very interested in what happened with what Trump's followers seemed to say during the 10 days of the softening. And Jeff Sessions and Ann Coulter and Laura Ingraham and all the Sarah Palin, the pundit class that's been behind Trump, has been pushing Trump's restrictionism, was outraged. And they jumped up and down, and smoke came out of their ears, and we all read the quotes in the media about this is a betrayal and an outrage. But if you read the media stories about the actual rank and file Trump followers, they kind of shrugged. They said, well, we're sure he'll do the right thing, and, we don't know, and, we're not upset, and I'm still behind him. And so I started to wonder what that was about. If he's done a 180 and the supporters don't seem to mind, what does that suggest? And so I started digging into the polling that's been done of questions that have been asked of Trump supporters. And what I found are some very interesting surprises. And, I'd seen this polling, but I hadn't kind of put it all together before. I mean, yes, they definitely want a wall. 80% want a wall. 60% of all Republicans want a wall. There's no chinks in the armor around the wall. But, excuse the pun, yeah. But Trump voters are surprisingly divided on what to do about the 11 million. And a Pew poll in March said, should we allow people who meet certain requirements to stay in the country, or should they be deported? And the answer was almost half and half. I mean, it led slightly on the deported side. 52% said deport them, but 47% said let them stay. And when you ask, of course, and only 40% actually want to take active steps to get rid of them. So we want them gone, but we're not willing to do that much, and half are willing to let them stay. And meanwhile, I'm sure you've all seen the polling. Republicans in general, 75%, every poll consistent, support some kind of comprehensive reform with the path to legal status, and indeed many support a path to citizenship. And of course, this is just a few anecdotal poll questions, but to me, it started to add up to maybe at least a question, if not a picture. Could it be that these people are frustrated? They're angry. They do obviously, they're angry at their own circumstance. They want control. They do miss an America that thinks they're gone, and they're kind of willing to blame it in a general way on immigrants. But do they really support Trump's policy down to the letter? I'm not sure they do. I think there's a general sense that there's something wrong, and they want control of immigration, the same way they want control of their lives. But I'm not sure they're where many people think they are on the immigration particulars. And so I think the question will be, assuming, as many people were assuming this morning, and I don't necessarily know that this will be the outcome. I don't think anyone does. But let's assume Hillary is the president, and who knows about the Senate. Let's even assume a Democratic Senate, and let's assume a Republican House. How's this going to play out? And obviously there's a danger. Obviously there's a danger that Republicans will just hear, what the Martians saw. We'll think there's this great wave of xenophobia and hate, and we have to cater to it, and we have to speak to it, and we can't vote the way we believe. But I think there's also kind of a broad misunderstanding of where most congressional Republicans are on immigration, right? I think the conventional wisdom is that there's a over my dead body camp, and that's most people, and then there's kind of Paul Ryan and a few supporters, trying to tame them. I think it's just the opposite, actually. I mean, I look back to the May 2014 whip count when 140 congressional Republicans in the House, told Paul Ryan and Mario Diaz-Balart that they were prepared to vote for a path to legal status. 140. And I don't think those people. They had a lot of different reasons. They are worried about Latino voters. They're listening to the farmers in their district. They're listening to the IT businesses in their district, whatever it is. But I don't think they've necessarily changed their views. Again, I think they could hear what they think is the Trump vote and be afraid to vote their views. But I think there may be some more room to maneuver there than we think. I don't think most Trump voters, I think they do want a wall, but I don't think they necessarily want to deport all 11 million people. And I think they could be sold, basically, sensible immigration reform that had tough enforcement, a wall and interior enforcement, and a lot of things a lot of the people in this room won't like, but would have some answer for the people already here and some fixes for the future so that it doesn't happen again. I'm not sure the political class can get there. I'm not sure Ds and Rs can find the way to compromise, but I think if they can, there might be more room to maneuver than we think.
Thanks, Tamar. I'm going to skip over Daniel for 1 second, if that's okay with you, and go to you, Linda, to talk a little bit about this. It seems like implicit in what Tamar is talking about is what the role of leadership is in this issue. Is this something where Trump arrived on the scene and distilled a phenomenon or sentiments that were already out there, found that this was a good rallying cry for people? I'm struck by the fact that he actually tweeted out the day the Republican, quote, autopsy report came out, that advocating for comprehensive immigration reform was a death wish for the GOP. So it's not, it may be opportunistic, it's an opportunity he's been focusing on taking advantage of for at least, more than 3 years, it sounds like. As someone who's been watching this debate play out in the Republican Party, is public sentiment as malleable as maybe Tamar is suggesting, that these same people that were going to go with the program for George W. Bush and immigration reform on September 6, 2001, are now falling in line behind Donald Trump, and these are the very same voters? Has there been some change in sentiment? What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, in terms of a voting issue, immigration today, immigration yesterday, and my guess is immigration tomorrow will never be a big voting issue. It's not what people vote on. It just never has been. It's probably a larger fraction of voters vote on that issue today than they did, say, 20 years ago. But that isn't what has been driving this issue. And I have been involved in this for a very long time, probably longer than anybody on the panel. I wrote my first book, which was published in 1991, called Out of the Barrio. And I wrote about immigration. There was a whole chapter in it. I wrote about the Federation for Immigration Reform. I wrote about the 1986 law. And I wrote about the English language movement, because I had been, for a brief time period, president of U.S. English that wanted to have a constitutional amendment declaring English the official language. But my position on immigration was then and is now that it's really quite simple to solve illegal immigration. We simply need to change our legal immigration system so that it's market-driven and is flexible and allows people to come in, provided they have the skills that we need. And we need those skills not just, among computer engineers and doctors and scientists and mathematicians. We also need it at the lower end of the scale, because frankly, we are a very educated population, and it is very hard to convince somebody with a high school degree or 2 years of college under their belt to go work in a chicken processing plant. So I've always had the same position. What has been interesting to me is that at the time that I wrote that book, I was attacked by the left. The left thought that when I said that Hispanics were like every other immigrant group that had come in before, they were assimilating, they were learning English, they were intermarrying, they were actually even voting not in a majority, but in a fairly significant minority for conservative candidates. That was considered heresy by the left. I say those same things today, and now I'm called a rhino. I'm no longer a Republican. And in fact, what's interesting, I just recently had the not such distinct pleasure of speaking at the Western Conservative Summit directly after Donald Trump spoke in July. And I was following to do a panel on immigration reform. And Danielle has been, has heard me talk about this issue before public fora in Colorado and elsewhere. Others here know my position and know the kind of stance I take. And usually in Republican circles, it was taken pretty seriously. It was often the first time that conservatives heard that Latino immigrants were learning English, graduating from high school, going on to college, intermarrying, becoming successful and part of the middle class. But they were willing to accept that that was happening. Well, I went and I gave the same speech as I always give before an audience that was made up of Trump supporters. And my husband, who was in the audience and he's disabled, he had a cane with him, he thought he was going to have to fight people off. I was, basically told, I think they would have liked to tell me to go home to Mexico, but, I had made it clear that my family came in 1601, so it's a long time ago. It was just such, I have never had that kind of hostile reception. So I think while you're right, Tamar, there is, this is not a huge voting issue. There is a fraction of the Republican Party and certainly the alt-right that for whom this is the single biggest issue. And I do believe that they are very effective. And one of the most important things, I think, is to follow the money. The way in which this issue, when I could, in all good conscience in 1991, have the same position I have today and be, a folk hero among conservatives, and now I'm a rhino, is that there is a very well-funded network.
Tell them what a rhino is.
Yeah, a Republican in name only.
It's not a compliment.
It's not a compliment, no. The Federation for American Immigration Reform, Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA, and a plethora of other organizations that raise money on this. So do some of the big conservative think tanks. The Heritage Foundation, which once had a position on this issue indistinguishable from mine, now does a lot of direct mail fundraising on the immigration issue. It has become an issue that you can raise money on. And it has become an issue in which you can get listeners if you have a talk radio show, or viewers if you have a cable TV show, and your ratings will go up. It gets people mad, it gets people angry. And the problem with that is those people are highly motivated, and it may not be a large fraction of the party, but it's enough of the party that when a bill comes up, Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham get on the airwaves, and you have a flood of calls into members of Congress. So I am less optimistic just on the question of whether or not conservatives can be turned around on this. I think the best way for conservatives to be turned around on this, and I say this as a conservative, is for Donald Trump to have a humiliating defeat in November.
Thanks, Linda. Danielle, let's go to you next, because I guess you're somebody who's trying to bend the curve on this issue, it seems, in terms of trying to attract Latinos to a conservative philosophy. I understand you guys don't want to probably say explicitly Republican, but that's what you've been involved in. I was down at Christmas time in Florida, and somebody was handing out frozen turkeys. Was that you guys who were handing out frozen turkeys?
We do give out frozen turkeys because people can't afford them, not for any other reason.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about the outreach that you're undertaking, and tell us who's behind it, because Linda's suggesting there's money being spent, I guess, and raised on the more restrictionist side of the immigration issue. I take it you guys are coming from a different perspective. Whose money is it, and how are you trying to attract Latinos to a more conservative political message?
A little bit about myself. I was born in '68 in California in the Central Valley. My parents saw America as the promised land. They were from a small town called Garza, González, Nuevo León, Mexico, which is in the north of Mexico near the city of Monterrey. They came as farm workers, and they would follow the crop season from California to Nebraska to the state of Washington. I was a farm worker until I was 18 years of age. So high school dropout at 17 because of the work that we did. Kept me out of school a lot. So at 17 years old, I'm a farm worker with no prospects of a professional career. 17 years later, I'm working at the White House for George W. Bush. What a country. It's 200 million immigrants have come to America throughout the arc of history, probably a little bit more, but they've made our nation richer, stronger. They've made our economy vibrant. They're innovators, they're entrepreneurs. They create their own wealth and create opportunities for others. So at the LIBRE Initiative, we're very strong pro-immigration because we feel again, that it addresses market forces when we have a flexible, market-based immigration reform. We want to induce family cohesion instead of ripping families apart. And then, of course, we just want to make our communities diverse and rich. So we have been very much driving ideas that advance immigration reform. Now, for us, the optimum immigration position or policy would be a path to citizenship for the 11 million that are here. Let's get on with the business of assimilation. And then we can address issues at the border and whatever, so that there is a sense of order I live in Mission, Texas. I live blocks away from Ansaldua's bridge where the surge was happening. It's a nice neighborhood, by the way. But I am concerned on both sides. The political climate is just as concerning to me on the Democrat side as it is on the Republican side. And this isn't being an apologist for the Republicans. Legitimately, there is one candidate on one side who presumes to define what immigration reform is and who promises more than she can deliver. And she knows it. A president of America does not get to impose law. You don't get to promise a law with somehow some affirmation that you're going to make it happen on your own. You don't get to do that in America. The President of the United States has to take due care to execute the laws that have been passed by a Congress, the legislative arm of our government. That means that Democrats don't get to define what immigration reform is, and neither do Republicans. They both do. They have to come together and reconcile their differences. They have to reach consensus. They have to be pragmatic on an issue that where you have one side where one is promising everything under the sun to get a vote, and the other is distancing himself from the issue or from any kind of reasonable approach to immigration reform for votes. We were the first ones out of the block that actually condemned Donald Trump's policy positions. We felt it was crazy to want to rescind birthright citizenship. It's part of the Constitution. We wanted to intercept remittances of hardworking immigrants who are sending their money back to their grandmothers and their mothers and their family. It's cruel, as far as we're concerned. You wanted to deport 11 million folks when really our economy needs to address market forces, and we need to allow our private sector to hire who they need to hire, not who politicians want them to hire. And that means sometimes you need to hire very basic skills and very high skills. Linda, who I'm honored to be sitting by, was talking about the folks Americans that don't take these jobs. In my 10 years of working the fields, I mean, literally working the fields a lot, I can count to you the number of non-Latinos I saw on one hand that I saw in the fields. And that's orchards and fields. So I mean, come on. 8 million, the 11 million currently work. Of the 8 million, 2 million are agricultural workers. We need them desperately. They are an asset to us. But it strikes me that when I think the political environment turns on Democrats, they turn on immigrants. What I mean to say is 5 Democrat senators told Barack Obama to hold off on executive action because it wasn't in their interest during that election season, and he did. 2, Lunger and Grimes and Landrieu in Louisiana attacked the Republican opposition for their support of amnesty in commercials. I promise you that if 70% of Latinos were voting Republican, Democrats would flee, and they'd be on the other side of the issue. So we need to find a way to reach consensus, and we need leaders who are going to negotiate in good faith. I love that Paul Ryan is one of those people that is pulling people towards the middle, and McMorris Rogers and Goodlatte and McCarthy and Ballard on the Republican side. We need more of those folks. We need more of those folks on the Democrat side. In 2007, right after I had left the White House, the Senate under Frist, Republicans had passed a Senate bill. You know who was the Speaker of the House at the time in the House? Nancy Pelosi. And Rahm Emanuel led the charge to kill it because they were protecting their freshman Democrat congressman because the unions were saying they were going to pool their money if they supported immigration reform. And they killed it. So, I mean, there's blame on both sides, on the Republicans and Democrats. And I think as a people, we need to hold both sides accountable and demand that they come to the middle and reach consensus on this very, very important issue.
And Danielle, do tell us a little bit more about specifically what your group is doing with the Latino community in terms of conservative causes and advocacy. And is there money behind it the same way Linda's talking about the money on the other side of this equation with Numbers USA and Heritage and so forth?
Yeah, so yes, there's money behind it. In America, the way we advance any kind of social change is that you need people. And you need resources to sustain the efforts of those people. And so there's money. We're in 10 states. We're 75 full-time staff at the LIBRE Initiative with about 50 contracted workers. We have almost 20,000 enlisted volunteers who are helping us drive a conservative free market agenda to the Latino community. Millions and millions of Latinos just got sick and tired of the liberal left presuming to represent all Latinos. They do not. And neither do conservatives represent all Latinos. We need to have an honest discussion about all the issues that impact us economically, culturally, and on the issue of immigration. And I got tired also of the restrictionists, on the conservative side, representing Latinos who are not restrictionists, who see immigration as a value to our country. So, we're part of an organization that finally has some muscle across the country, where we mobilize Latinos across the country to also get behind an agenda that is going to lessen the tax burden, the regulatory burden, that's going to reverse the irresponsible spending in Washington, D.C., the cronyism, support school choice, but also drive the issue of immigration reform. Now, for us, this has been critical to give a different face to, not because for the sake of giving a different face or just to gain the appeal and the support of the Latino community, because we honestly believe that these are good ideas that are going to make America stronger. So in 2014, you saw Republicans who actually engaged with the Latino community at a way higher level than they had in the past. Colorado, for example, you had a state where Barack Obama had won in 2008 65% of the Latino vote. In 2012, he won 85% of the Latino vote. Michael Bennett won 90% of the Latino vote. It was going the wrong direction as far as conservatives were concerned with the Latino community. Cory Gardner makes a concerted effort to reach out to Latinos, while Udall was running a war on women message and entirely took the Latino vote for granted, was indifferent to them, did nothing to engage them and mobilize them. Cory Gardner got 45% of the Latino vote. And you think, well, maybe that's an anomaly. In Kansas, Brownback and Roberts got 45% of the Latino vote each. Deal and Purdue in Georgia got 45% of the Latino vote. I think it was 44 and 47% in Georgia. You had Cornyn, 52% of the Latino vote in Texas, and Greg Abbott for governor, 44%. Scott, 45% in Florida. Christie, 52%. Will Hurd, in San Antonio, District 23, a black Republican challenger, took out a Latino Democrat incumbent in San Antonio 23, a predominantly Latino district. That shows a maturity of the Latino voter. That's something else. And of course, you had Brian Sandoval got 73% of the vote in Nevada and flipped the House and the Senate in Harry Reid's state for the first time since the 1920s. Susana Martinez, who got 63% of the vote, flipped the House for the first time since the 1950s, and Colorado, who also flipped the Senate for the first time since the 1950s. So when you engage the Latino vote, you'll be rewarded.
Maybe any of you can answer this question, but have there, in your view, been a lot of profiles of courage within the GOP within the last year or two since we've been going through this Trump phenomenon of people who have spoken up and said, I have a totally different view on this issue? It strikes me that it's not only Donald Trump as a person that you can excoriate, but there were many other people in that Republican presidential field, for example, whose positions seemed to either go silent or prove far more malleable than they sounded at the outset. Some people that were held up as heroes for the immigration reform movement found themselves almost mute in the face of the Trump onslaught. So I'm curious if you think there are such people, and also if the election goes as many people expect at the moment, if Clinton were to win and Trump gets beaten, does that affect some change to this dynamic, or has Trump proven that you can get an awful lot of attention and at least some votes by staking out a fairly extreme position on the immigration issue?
Yeah, so I think the profiles in courage are less interesting and less important than the people behind the scenes who say, I want to get it done and I'm going to work to get it done next year. So we had, my organization organizes small dinners with senators policy dinners off the record. We had a dinner with a senator last week who is on nobody's list as an immigration reformer, who, when Harry Reid asked him if he was going to run again in his next cycle, said, only if I can get something done, and the thing I've picked to get done is immigration reform. And, he has a whole different version of how it's going to work. It's not a Gang of Eight bill, and it doesn't involve Chuck Schumer, and it's a whole different road. But there are people in both houses who know we have to put this behind us. And again, for various reasons. It might be the Latino vote, it might be the economy, it might just be get it off the table. I'm not saying they all share exactly this audience's view of why it needs to get done, but there are a lot of people waiting there who do think it needs to get done. We're going to have the battle of our lives over the party. David Frum predicted that this morning, and he's certainly right. And those Trump people will come with a lot of strength, and the bigots within the Trump faction, and there certainly are some, I'm not saying there aren't, will come with a lot of strength. But there are a lot of people who take a different view. And I don't expect no one, it doesn't make sense to stand up now and push back against Trump. What's going to matter is, will they stand up later? And I think there are a lot of people there who will stand up. Again, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. And I'm not saying that, again, I'm skeptical that Hillary Clinton is going to come with the right offer. I think if she tries to do, a Gang of Eight again in the Senate and throw it to the House, that's crazy. And if she says my way or the highway, you can forget legislating for however many years she's in office. And there's again many more. There are 10 scenarios here that are absolutely roads to disaster, and there's one narrow way that you might be able to do it that does, I believe, as Frank Sherry said this morning, start with probably Schumer and Hillary Clinton and Paul Ryan sitting down in a back room and figuring out the shape of a deal, and then going forward. And will that happen? I don't know.
If she goes forward with a what you might call a DACA on steroids as an executive action, what does that do to the scenario?
I don't think they legislate on anything in the Congress as long as she's president.
Correct.
I think it's over.
If I could briefly say, this idea, we had about 17 candidates, and practically all of them, with the exception perhaps of Trump and Ted Cruz, were supportive of a form of legalization. Some of them made that point during the debates. But this is politics. And the left, for a very long time, and I agree with Dan, has been trying to create this perception, very simple perception. It's all about the Latino vote. Republicans are bad, they're anti-immigrant, and Democrats are good. Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton, during the primary, said, we talk about Trump, but the reality is that more or less all of the candidates, all the presidential candidates, are more or less like him. And nobody challenged that. But I agree with Tamar. The reality is very different in Congress. And I think that it's not, within the Republican side, it's not, well, we have some establishment pro-business candidates like politicians like John McCain or Mario Diaz-Balart who are good in immigration, and then we have other restrictionists. That's not the case. In the middle, you have a majority of Republicans who are good conservatives, believe in the Constitution, and want to deal with the issue of immigration in a constructive way. Perhaps they don't agree with what was in the Gang of Eight, but they're willing to negotiate. Now, I think, frankly, some in the left, even some who've advocated for immigration reform, have really discounted and not paid attention to those conservatives. They think that a bilateral effort is, just working with people like McCain and Lindsey Graham. Look, I love those guys, but we have to go beyond them. And there are good conservatives, Tea Party conservatives, who want to do something on immigration. And part of that discussion means also talking about guest workers. Mm-hmm. But there are Democrats that don't want to talk about guest work, having a workable guest worker program. Not what was in the Gang of Eight bill, which was not workable. But actually, let's have that conversation. And then we'll find room to negotiate. But comprehensive immigration reform is not the Gang of Eight bill. That's the version of the left. I think there is room. But the question here is, if Hillary becomes president, will she be willing to build consensus? Because at the end, the only way we're going to solve the problem is by passing legislation, not through executive action. I don't know if executive action is constitutional or not, but I will tell you this. Right now is the big obstacle to achieving immigration reform. And the only way to achieve this is through legislation, a legislation that provides a path to legal status to the undocumented. But the undocumented are just a symptom of the problem. The problem is the need America has for foreign workers. That is the reality. And at the end, the question is, do we need more or less immigration? And there's a divide that goes beyond left-right. we had a candidate, Bernie Sanders, saying that immigration generally is not good for the country. Immigrants take jobs away from Americans. Big labor agrees with that. There are many in big labor that are actually happy with some of the positions of Donald Trump. And if we say no, I mean, that's a reality. I mean, some of the leadership when the national labor movement was saying that they have members that are willing to vote for Trump because precisely of that idea. So I think that as we move forward, an argument, and we can't take the Trump phenomenon for granted, realize that there is some validity there. We have a middle class that is decreasing, income inequality expanding, and it's easy to blame free trade immigration. One of the big problems that we've had in arguing for immigration reform is that we haven't made the case, I know Tamar has made it, but not everyone. Certainly, I don't think the Chamber of Commerce has made the argument convincingly that immigration is good for the American middle class. Because if we only argue about compassion on one side, or about business, we need to grow business, a lot of people who represent working class Americans are going to say, why are we going to support this? How does this benefit America? So the entire idea of America first, that's a valid point of view. How does immigration help the American worker? And I think there are studies that show that more immigration actually helps create jobs for Americans. That's a very powerful point that we need to make more forcefully. And that is the argument that will help bring in those conservative Republicans that want to work on immigration. But
Can I jump in for 1 second? I want to hear from Danielle and Linda on this point of what they see as the most likely path forward, particularly if we do have a Clinton administration. Just saying, people have to work together, and people have had to work together on this for 20 years and haven't done a great job.
I guess what I want to do is call out the hypocrisy here, right? Here you have Hillary Clinton, who said, I am adamantly against immigrants. Look at them. They're standing there in the street corner. Nobody should hire those people. I'm not making it up. You can look it up on YouTube.
2003, in a radio interview.
As Senator of New York, she also said, send the children back to Central America when she was asked, right when it was happening, in the midst of it. She also has voted for 700 miles of wall. So, numerous times, quote unquote, she told somebody in a town hall, which is Donald Trump's position, by the way. She also, as candidate for president the first time, spoke against issuing driver's licenses to undocumented folks. So here you have somebody who has spoke with contempt and derision against immigrants, and now says she'll go. Here's the incoherency. Here's the incongruent part of what Alfonso was talking about. She promises immigration reform in her first 100 days, but she's going to go beyond Barack Obama and executive action. Which is it? You're already tipping your hat. You know you're not going to get immigration reform because, as Tamar just said, here's the thing. She says to Latinos, if you vote for me, I will promise you immigration reform. What she doesn't tell Latinos is this. If you vote for me, I'll get you immigration reform as long as I get everything I want. Well, you're not going to get everything you want, are you? And so you need to call that out. I guess is my point. That's why I mentioned it. It's not just to say it. We do need to come to the middle on these issues.
All right, Linda, you got some thoughts? If people have questions, we're going to take questions from the audience in just a minute. So
my biggest fear is that this is going to be 1986 all over again, and that we are going to get some form of, I don't call it amnesty if you have to pay a fine, but that we're going to get a legalization program, whether it's legalization that will ultimately lead to citizenship or simply legalization, that will happen. But that we don't fix the real problem, which is greatly expanding the number of legal immigrants we take into this country. And again, not to do it out of humanitarian reasons, although that's a good thing, but because we need them. We need workers. We need people. The irony is that the restrictionists, a lot of people say, oh, well, fair, they're racist. No, they're really not racist. They hate all human beings. They want to make the United States go back to a country of 150 million. And as I always tell my conservative audiences, which side of the room wants to leave? and go back to your ancestral lands, because that's what they're about. They want to go back to a 19th century agrarian kind of economy where everybody does their own work, and it's a utopian fantasy, but it's not particularly right-wing. It is out of the anti-population control movement, which is where all of them came from. So my big fear is that we're going to see 1986, we're going to have a legalization program, but we're not going to fix our legal immigration laws to be market-based, to be flexible, to include a guest worker program, because not everybody who comes wants to come and become American. Some people, there are a lot of workers, both male and female, who would gladly leave family behind, come work for a few years, get a stakehold, be able to go back home, start a small business or whatever, and they ought to have a path to be able to do that, because we need those workers. And that is my big fear. And I will tell you that if Hillary Clinton tries to do a DACA-DAPA on steroids, that will be the end of any discussion for legislation. That was the single most destructive thing that Barack Obama did with the DAPA program. I am very sympathetic and understanding that for a lot of people it represented hope, but I will tell you it killed the chance of any meaningful immigration reform as long as he is in the White House.
Tamar wants to make a quick
Let me
comment.
get 1 minute. So you asked for a path forward. So do a bunch of other things first. Build trust on infrastructure where you do actually do something with Republicans that you can find a way in the middle, not as inflammatory as immigration. Do infrastructure, do something else. I don't know how you handled Supreme Court, but try to be compromising on that. Build some trust, show that you want to work together, then start in a back room with Schumer and Paul Ryan and come up with the shape of a deal and then sell it. And it's going to probably be, it's not called comprehensive. Republicans hate comprehensive. They are willing to move small pieces, in a short period of time. I'm not saying one piece and then wait a year, but break it up into pieces. It's path to legal status, not path to citizenship. And it's going to have tough enforcement, and enforcement that includes not just walls, but, probably something, sanctuary cities, all that stuff Trump has brought up. But there's a path. But again, it's a tricky path.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Josh. I want to thank you, Mr. Aguilar.
Give us your name, please.
Kwasisi Osho from Washington College of Law, and then also African churches, Christian churches in the area, representing them. You answered my first question, which was, have the advocacy groups done the service to the immigrant community by not advocating the things that they should be advocating, instead making this immigration issue about one voting bloc, one group of people? And primarily, I understand that most immigrants in this country are today from a Latin origin, but by making it just about them is doing a disservice to immigration reform. Second, addressing the fact that I came to this country 10 years ago, and probably viewing what is happening during this election from the perspective of somebody probably who came down from Mars. So I am removed from the whole thing, non-Democrat, non-Republican. But seeing a candidate who has taken you along this head-spinning ride on just one single issue, and I have talked to many other people on different policy issues who have had their head spinning as well, and we're now electing a president of a country like Togo, West Africa, who has no power in the world. We're electing the president of the United States, who can make one decision today and destroy the whole earth.
Let me try and put the question to them. I think that the question, if I'm not mistaken, is there too much focus in this debate on the Latino community within the, as a subdivision within the overall immigration debate, or does it make logical sense to have them receive as much focus in this discussion as they do? Is that the first part of your question?
And then my last comment and the question is just two words, few words. In the Republican Party, what is the debate right now in terms of if we are statesmen or statesmen and women between these two candidates, which one is the best to lead the country In terms of
Got it.
policy
Got it.
decision making.
Thank you.
They're not easy questions. Let me see if I can provide a short answer. The first question is something that I've thought about. The problem in Washington with any issue is that movements are created. And sometimes the movements have a reality of their own. And people say, I'm part of the movement, so I have to agree with what the consensus is of the movement, rather than thinking of the principles. Look, what is the immigration reform movement? I mean, I know a lot of advocates. I see that there's an immigration reform movement that is of the left, where there is a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus. I disagree with many of the things that they believe in. I think that there are people in the immigration reform movement that have used, yes, the issue of immigration politically in alliance with the Democratic Party to push this simplistic vision that Republicans are bad on immigration and Democrats are good. I don't want to generalize. There are many good people in the left, in the immigration reform movement, that are really concerned and committed to immigration reform. But sometimes I feel that there are many also who are more concerned about the movement than the issue. And look, I'm a conservative. A lot of my conservative colleagues are saying, what are you doing? You're not going to support Mr. Trump? What is the alternative? Well, how can I support Mr. Trump, right? At the end, it's a question of issues and principles. So yes, I think a lot of advocates, not just a few, have, I think, because of their commitment to the Democratic Party and liberal ideology, helped use immigration for political purposes to try to help the Democrats get the Latino vote. I believe that. In the same way that on the Republican side, there are many who perhaps believe in immigration but have remained silent, afraid of angering Rush Limbaugh or Laura Ingraham instead of being courageous. On the second question, it's a very difficult question, and I'm not a one-issue person, and what I'm telling Latino voters, and again, I don't claim to represent all Latinos. I mean, we already have too many groups around this town that go around saying that they represent all Latinos. I'm here only to say that there are Latinos that are conservative. And what I'm going to do, and what I encourage others to do as Latino voters, is come out and vote in record numbers. We have to come out and vote in record numbers. However, you don't have to choose a candidate. I will never vote for Hillary Clinton. It's not over immigration, about many issues that I disagree with her. So what would I do? I will vote, and I will generally vote Republican, but in the presidential ballot, I will leave that part of the ballot blank, and that's a valid vote. And perhaps it's actually a fitting vote, because both parties have played politics with this issue. And when you look at polling of Hispanics over and over again, they say, the majority, that they're not affiliated with one party or the other. They're voting Democratic because they feel antagonized by Republican politicians. But they still have concerns with a lot of the policy positions of the Democrats. So, and I think that's healthy. I think that's very healthy. So that's what I would recommend. That is what I'm going to do.
We'll go this gentleman, and then we're going to wrap it up.
So my name is Chris Ramon. I'll present my question after an anecdote. I was 10 years old in California when Prop 187 was being debated. My mother's undocumented, and I remember, and she was actually legalized in 1986 because of that law. And I remember wondering why my people were being demonized by the Republican Party. And I remember my grandmother saying, son los republicanos, son racistas. And that left a very long impression for me, and I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I never will switch, because of what the Republican Party did in California. So here's my question. There are going to be 10-year-olds right now who are Latinos. They're watching this campaign. They may have a similar reaction to conservatives and the Republican movement. You guys are talking about ideas, but I'm talking about emotions and historical memory. Their grandparents and their parents will be talking about this for generations and for years to come. How are you going to address that? Because I think you guys aren't addressing that question.
Oh, no.
Our communities do not forget. Los somos payasos.
I think that's exactly right, and it's something I've been talking about for a very long time. In fact, if you go back to the Nixon White House in 1972, about a third of Mexican Americans voted for Richard Nixon. And the trend was somewhere between 30% and up to 45% or so in presidential races were voting Republican. And then you had Prop 187, and Bob Dole drew below 30%. And Prop 187, sponsored by the governor in California, who had been previously a senator and considered a moderate Republican, jumped on that 187 bandwagon, and it essentially turned California into a blue state, and it will never, I don't think, get out of that position. And it is in large part because of that feeling of disrespect. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult, which is why, as a Republican, as a conservative, as somebody who believes that the Republican Party more represents my principles on a variety of issues than the Democratic Party does, I really believe that unless Donald Trump is defeated, and not by a small margin, because then people like me, the never-Trumpers, are going to be blamed. It's got to be a big defeat, and I think only then will you see a real house cleaning in the Republican Party, and hopefully the party can get back to being the party of Lincoln. It isn't today. Today it's the party of Trump, and I think it is a very big problem.
Let me just say also that the governor that year lost the Latino vote by a gap of 6 points. The governor the next 4 years, candidate Republican, lost it by 46 points. The next 4 years, he lost it by 61 points, the gap between the Latino vote. There was a distancing that occurred because of 187. In 2012, Barack Obama got 80% of the minority vote. Mitt Romney got 63% of the white vote. That's quite a contrast. There's something going on. And it concerns me because I'm not a Republican for partisan reasons or because I want white people to like me. I have been a Republican because I care about my community and because the ideas work, right? I believe in limited government. I don't believe in centralizing power and money in Washington, D.C. I believe that parents should have school choice. I believe we should lessen the tax burden on Latino entrepreneurs and the regulatory burden. I believe in all these things because it makes my community better, right? And so, but when we don't engage, when we don't advance ideas, and when we're showcasing these really bad ideas, that's I think when Latinos are turned off. Look, we're very young. We're 27 years median age, while the rest of the country is 37 years median age. 90% of all Latinos under 18 are born in America. We're going to be a massive voting bloc. So the Republican Party has to get its act together and start engaging and driving pro-growth ideas that are going to generate increase in productivity in the private sector that generate jobs and increase economic opportunities. That's the ticket.
I need to push back, however, a little bit on this narrative because no somos payasos, pero no somos borregos. We're not clowns, but we're not sheep either. The Latino community is not a monolithic community. We had Proposition 187, but then we had George Bush winning, 44% of the Latino vote in 2004. Latinos are a very sophisticated vote, different countries of origin. We have people who are multi-generational, who've been here for many, many generations, people who've just arrived, who may be much more conservative on many issues. Immigration is not the only issue. So I think that you're not going to lose the Latino vote for a generation. I think Trump loses the election. If you have 4 years from now a good Republican candidate who's good on immigration, and immigration is the gateway issue, it's not the top issues, good on immigration, is constructive on the issue, that person, he, she, will become competitive with the Latino vote. But this idea that you're going to lose the entire Latino vote, we're not monolithic. We have very different issues that interest us. We have Cuban Americans, we have Puerto Ricans in Central Florida. Certainly 66% of Latino voters are Mexican. We also have Central American. We cannot make generalizations that the Latino vote is going to be lost forever. What happened in California, I must say, it's a very particular phenomenon that could be repeated in other parts of the country, but it's a very California experience, very different from what could have happened in Texas. I mean, in Texas, we saw some terrible rhetoric, but still, John Cornyn did very well. Abbott did very well, who took some positions that I didn't agree with on immigration. Why? Because he was opposing Wendy Davis, a candidate who was very radical on social issues, and Latinos care about those issues. So I wouldn't make generalizations. I agree that the Republican Party, I've been talking about this since I started my organization, needs to open itself up to Latinos and be constructive on the issue of immigration. But don't assume that you're going to lose the Latino vote for generations. The question is, how many elections does the Republican Party at the national level have to lose to get that lesson? Yeah. That is the question.
I think, did you want to?
No, I'm good.
All right, well, I think that brings us to a pretty good note. Whether we see that rise from the ashes moment that Linda's talking about or Alfonso's talking about, I guess we'll see in the course of the next year or two. We're going to move right on to the next panel on refugee resettlement. So please stay in the room, stay in your seats, and just give us 1 minute to reset. Thanks to the panel and everybody else. Thank you for coming.